in the shadow of Rome's most infamous tyrants, beyond the names etched into marble in memory, Nero, Caligula, Commodus, there exists another emperor. One whose reign was brief, whose portraits were shattered, whose name was nearly erased from history. And yet, for those who know where to look, the evidence whispers of a ruler more lethal, more destabilizing, and perhaps more terrifying than any of them. It begins in the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire was not the indestructible titan we imagine, but a fragile giant trembling under its own weight. Borders were collapsing, armies were mutinying, plague had scarred the population. In this chaos, emperors did not reign for decades. They survived for months, sometimes weeks. Assassination was not a possibility, it was an expectation. And then he appeared. A soldier elevated by his troops, a provincial outsider with no noble lineage to soften his rise. Ancient sources describe him as towering, brutal, and consumed by suspicion. A man who trusted no senator, no general, no citizen. A man who turned Rome's greatest weapon, its army, against its own heart. His name was Maximinus Thrax. For centuries, he was dismissed as a barbarian brute, a crude strongman who bullied the Senate and bled the empire dry. But recent scholarship and newly examined archaeological evidence suggests something far darker. What if Maximinus was not simply cruel, but systematically destructive? What if his reign triggered a chain reaction that nearly ended Rome itself? Fragments of statues with faces deliberately smashed, inscriptions where his name has been chiseled away, records of mass executions so extensive that entire political families vanished from the historical record. The clues are scattered, incomplete, as though someone wanted them buried. Rome survived Caligula's madness. It endured Nero's flames. But during the reign of Maximinus Thrax, the empire fractured in ways it had never fractured before. And the most chilling part? Most people have never heard of him. As historians piece together the violent puzzle of his rule, a new question emerges. Was Maximinus Thrax merely another unstable emperor? Or was he the catalyst for Rome's most dangerous internal collapse? Because when we begin to examine what truly happened during his reign, we find something far more disturbing than tyranny. We find a system turning on itself. And that system was Rome. The story of Maximinus Thrax does not begin with a triumphant coronation in Rome. It begins far from the capital, on the cold frontiers along the Rhine, where Roman legions stood guard against Germanic tribes and where loyalty was forged in blood rather than politics. In 235 AD, Emperor Severus Alexander attempted to negotiate with Rome's enemies instead of crushing them. To battle-hardened soldiers who had endured years of conflict, it was weakness. Mutiny ignited like dry tinder. And in the chaos, the troops turned to one of their own commanders, a massive Thracian-born general known for his physical strength and battlefield ferocity. Maximinus was not from Rome's aristocracy. He had never served in the Senate. He had never walked the polished floors of imperial palaces as a statesman. He was an outsider. And in a world where power often flowed through bloodlines and alliances, that made him dangerous. When Severus Alexander was murdered by his own men, Maximinus was proclaimed emperor by the army on the spot. Rome did not choose him. The legions did. And that distinction would define everything that followed. The Senate hesitated. Ancient historians record a mixture of fear and contempt. A peasant emperor, a giant from the provinces, a man rumored to stand over 8 feet tall, likely exaggerated, but symbolic of how alien he seemed to Rome's elite. Yet the Senate confirmed him. They had little choice. The army now held the true power of the empire, and Maximinus understood that better than anyone. What followed was not a traditional reign centered in Rome. Maximinus never even set foot in the capital as emperor. Instead, he ruled from military camps, pouring vast sums into the legions to secure their loyalty. To fund this, taxes skyrocketed. Wealthy citizens were accused of treason. Confiscations became routine. Executions multiplied. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals abrupt disruptions in provincial administration. Coinage debasement accelerated. Entire senatorial estates were seized. But perhaps most telling are the inscriptions. In several Roman cities, his name appears only briefly before being violently erased, chiseled away, scraped from stone. It was as though Rome itself was trying to forget. Yet the deeper historians dig into this period, the clearer it becomes that his reign was not simply brutal. It marked the beginning of a crisis that would tear the empire apart. And that crisis was only just beginning. The deeper we move into the 3rd century, the more the evidence stops looking like ordinary imperial cruelty and begins to resemble systemic collapse. The reign of Maximinus Thrax sits at the very threshold of what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year storm of civil wars, economic implosion, and near disintegration. And when we examine the timeline closely, his rule stands as the ignition point. Numismatic records tell one of the clearest stories. Coins minted under Maximinus show a dramatic reduction in silver content compared to earlier reigns. The currency was quietly diluted to pay soldiers at unprecedented levels. To the average citizen, this meant inflation, instability, and the erosion of trust in Rome's economy. Markets faltered, provincial trade slowed, the empire's financial arteries began to clog. But the economic strain was only the surface. Ancient historians like Herodian and the author of the Historia Augusta describe waves of executions aimed at senators and wealthy elites. Though these sources are biased and sometimes sensational, archaeological patterns support sudden political disappearances. Entire aristocratic households vanish from inscriptions after 235 AD. Estates change ownership abruptly. Titles cease to appear in public records. Maximinus did not simply intimidate Rome's elite. He dismantled their influence. In Africa, rebellion erupted when landowners, exhausted by confiscations, declared their own emperors in defiance. The Senate in Rome seized the opportunity, supporting the revolt and effectively declaring Maximinus a public enemy. For the first time in decades, the Senate openly opposed a reigning emperor. Civil war followed. Military movements recorded in inscriptions and papyri suggest frantic mobilizations across Italy. Cities fortified themselves against Roman legions. Roman soldiers prepared to fight Romans. And then there is Aquileia. In 238 AD, Maximinus marched on the northern Italian city after it refused him entry. Archaeological layers from the region reveal signs of siege, defensive reinforcements, destruction patterns consistent with military assault. Yet despite his hardened army, the siege stalled. Supplies ran thin. Morale deteriorated. Within his own camp, dissatisfaction grew. The emperor who had risen by military loyalty would fall by it. Accounts describe soldiers turning on him, assassinating him and his son inside their tent. Their severed heads were reportedly sent to Rome as proof. The Senate rejoiced. His memory was condemned. Statues were torn down, but the empire did not stabilize. Instead, the years following his death became even more chaotic. Multiple emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Borders fractured. Plague resurged. Breakaway states formed in Gaul and the East. The evidence suggests something unsettling. Maximinus did not just rule during crisis. His reign accelerated it, and that raises an uncomfortable question. Was he merely a symptom of Rome's decline, or the catalyst that made collapse inevitable? Mainstream historians argue that Maximinus Thrax was not uniquely monstrous, but tragically inevitable. By 235 AD, the Roman Empire was already strained beyond its limits. The Antonine Plague had devastated the population decades earlier. External threats along the Rhine and Danube intensified. The army had grown accustomed to political influence. In this view, Maximinus was simply the first barracks emperor, a product of soldiers choosing power over senatorial tradition. According to this interpretation, the real shift was structural. The Senate had long since lost meaningful control. Military strongmen were bound to emerge. If not Maximinus, then someone else. His brutality was less the cause of Rome's instability and more the reflection of a system where loyalty was transactional and violence was political currency. But alternative interpretations paint a darker portrait. Some scholars suggest that Maximinus fundamentally altered the balance between civil and military authority. By ruling exclusively from military frontiers and bypassing Rome entirely, he may have severed the symbolic unity that held the empire together. Emperors before him had relied on the army, yes, but they still performed the rituals of legitimacy in Rome. They respected the illusion of shared governance. Maximinus abandoned that illusion. He elevated the army above the Senate in practice and in ideology. His heavy taxation of elites and open hostility toward aristocratic families may have permanently fractured trust between the governing classes and imperial power. The African revolt of 238 was not merely opportunistic, it was desperate. Then there is the question of economic damage. Some economic historians argue that the rapid debasement of currency during his reign triggered long-term inflationary spirals that future emperors could not reverse. Military pay expectations soared. Each new emperor had to promise more than the last. The empire entered a cycle of short reigns funded by unsustainable payouts. And yet, contradictions remain. Why did so many provinces initially accept him? Why did the legions remain loyal for years before turning against him? Was he as cruel as later senatorial sources claimed, or was his image deliberately blackened after his death? Memory damnatio, the Roman practice of erasing disgraced rulers, clouds the record. What survives may be propaganda written by those who benefited from his fall. But even if exaggeration colored the accounts, the results are undeniable. After his assassination, the empire plunged into decades of instability unprecedented in Roman history. Theories diverge, interpretations clash. What does not change is this: after Maximinus Thrax, Rome was never the same. And the consequences would echo far beyond his severed head. When Maximinus Thrax died outside Aquileia, Rome believed it had eliminated the problem. The Senate celebrated. New emperors were installed. Order, it seemed, would return. It never did. Within a single year, 6 emperors would claim the throne. Some ruled for weeks, others for months. Assassinations became routine. Borders crumbled under coordinated invasions. The empire fractured into competing states. For nearly half a century, Rome teetered on the brink of permanent disintegration. Historians call it the crisis of the 3rd century. But behind that clinical label lies something more visceral, a superpower unraveling from within. Was Maximinus the spark that ignited it, or was he the first visible crack in a structure already collapsing? His reign represents a moment when Rome's identity shifted. No longer was the emperor primarily a statesman with military backing. He became a general first, ruler second. Political legitimacy flowed from soldiers, not institutions. The precedent proved irreversible. Even after the empire stabilized under later reformers like Diocletian, it never returned to its earlier form. Power became more centralized, more militarized, more autocratic. The old republican facade faded. The transformation from principate to dominate accelerated. In a sense, Maximinus may have marked the true end of classical Rome. And yet, the man himself remains strangely elusive. No grand monuments bear his name. Few statues survive intact. His story survives mostly in fragments, hostile accounts, shattered inscriptions, scattered coins. It is as if Rome wanted him forgotten. Perhaps that is the final mystery. History remembers flamboyant tyrants and decadent madmen. It remembers emperors who burned cities and staged spectacles. But it often overlooks the figures whose decisions quietly shift the foundations of civilizations. Maximinus Thrax may not have ruled long. He may not have set Rome ablaze. But the evidence suggests something more profound and more unsettling. He may have been the emperor who taught Rome how to fall. And if that is true, then the most dangerous rulers are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones history tries hardest to erase.